The "it's always the right time" deal.
Hey, want to go to Mickey D's for lunch?
Ooh, let's go now.
But it's not lunchtime yet.
If we're going to McDonald's, it's always the right time.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that.
There's a deal for every lunch hour at McDonald's.
And there's a classic for every craving. Mix and match 2 for just $3.50, like a McChicken, a McDouble, or a hot and spicy McChicken. Price and participation may vary. Single item at regular price. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Hi, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going back to 2000, and we're going to be looking at the election, the presidential election of 2000, Bush v. Gore. And Chris, we did our episode on 9/11, which of course happened less than a year after this, but we're sort of delving into some history we not only read about and study, but history that we personally remember.
Yeah, and I think especially during this time period in our society today, there's a lot of questions about elections and how they proceed and what happens if there's a contested election. And by contested election, we mean an election in which maybe one person is declared the winner, but there's some question as to whether that person actually did win. And so while it is history that has been in the past, it's also history that's been in the recent past as well. And I think it is important to see, how the founding fathers envisioned that there would be a checks and balances, a proper separation of powers, and that allows the government to operate in times of crisis, in times of confusion, to also ensure that there is certainty as to who is president or who is elected to a particular position.
Yeah, when I hear you say that, I think something that I often go back to in my mind, and that is trust in the system. The framers set up a system that, especially when you look at things like the Electoral College, it's not perfect. Even they understood it was not perfect. But it's a system that works if we just simply allow it to work. And I think that's really important when we think about 2000.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions that we'll see raised by the election of 2000 and also the recent 2020 election is this question, which might be a podcast in and of itself, is does the Electoral College work? Yes. Is the Electoral College something that needs to be revised or maybe even removed? And I think as we look at the 2000 presidential election results, for our listeners, there is the election results based by the state, and then there's this thing called the popular vote. And so I'm sure we'll get into a little bit about how that plays out in 2000, but also how it plays into an election in the state of North Carolina, right, or in your local county. Popular vote, that idea that if more people in your respective area vote for a particular candidate, you should win. Mm-hmm. The Electoral College will say, in an effort to present fairness to every person in the United States, mm-hmm, we do not have this majority rules kind of approach.
Yeah, it's a state-by-state election. You have the number of House seats plus 2 for the number of Senate seats per state, and that determines how many Electoral College votes each state gets. But you know what, going back to the Electoral College and the framers, if you read Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, you find that there was discussion even back then of maybe we need to do this on a popular vote, and there was disagreement among the framers exactly what would the best way to go about electing president. And I think elections like 2000 and 2020 do show us that no system's going to be perfect, no system's going to work the way we would like it to work necessarily 100% of the time. Chris, and we'll sort of start here, I guess, is when I look back at presidential history, there's been 5 times in American history where the winner of the popular vote did not win the presidency. And of course, we're talking about 1824 when John Quincy Adams ran against Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had more Electoral College votes, but he did not get a majority. He had more popular votes, but John Quincy Adams, when the election went to the House of Representatives, became president. You think about 1876 with Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden, and of course Hayes coming out with 1 electoral vote victory thanks to a House committee or a special election committee that gave him that particular vote. 1888, Benjamin Harrison versus Grover Cleveland, and we've done several episodes on Grover Cleveland. That was not a disputed election, but Benjamin Harrison, of course, won the Electoral College vote, even though Grover Cleveland actually won the popular vote. And Cleveland would come back a few years later in 1892 and win the election. And then, of course, Bush v. Gore in 2000 and Trump v. Clinton in 2016. So, 2000, I guess maybe the best place to start is the candidates, maybe. Chris, you want to talk about the candidates a little bit?
Yeah,
started on that.
Yeah, so as we start in the year of 2000, we have to remember, because we keep saying Bush v. Gore, Bush v. Gore.
Right.
There actually was a third candidate in there who was kind of the perennial underdog always, right? And that was Ralph Nader, who was part of, I believe it was the Green Party, and basically had a small group, as any historian or lover of history knows. Third-party candidates really never have a chance to be able to win, just because they don't have the money, they don't have the power that is found in the Democratic and Republican parties. But they can get in there and they can kind of stir up a little trouble. They can take people away. And so you have to ask yourself, if Nader is not in this contest, if he's not one of the candidates, then those people who voted for Nader would have chosen either Bush v. Gore, which could have made this whole thing moot.
Yep.
We're not even talking about it. But Ralph Nader, this wasn't the only time he ran. He ran in several other elections, and he was very famous for environmentalist and for a lot of other things. He was very good with economics and with monies. But he's kind of that person that is running. And then, of course, you have Al Gore, and Al Gore, who is the Democratic individual running. He was the vice president, who many people are familiar with Al Gore, but maybe in the wrong way, because Al Gore is very big on talking about climate change and the environment, but also his claim to fame is that he invented the internet. And
but he doesn't know how to use it that well.
Right. He doesn't use it, but he invented it. But he's the Democratic candidate.
By the way, just to clarify, we know he really didn't invent the internet.
Right. Well, we know that. Yeah. I'm not sure if he has come to that conclusion also, but we do know that. But so he is up against George Bush, and of course George Bush, as we know, he is the son to the former president George Bush, Daddy Bush, if you will. So this is the son Bush. George Bush was the governor for many years of the great state of Texas, and that kind of leads into this. Al Gore from Tennessee. You've got George Bush from Texas. When you start thinking about the Electoral College, and you even start thinking about popular vote, of course, Texas is a much larger state than Tennessee. Texas is always kind of leaning towards the Republican aspect. Tennessee is also led more towards Republican aspect. So when you're looking at elections, you're looking at the popular vote. Who is Ray going to vote for? Who is Chris going to vote for? But you also have to look at the states and how that's going to work out, because in 2000, Texas had 32 electoral votes, whereas Tennessee also had 31. No, it was 11. Excuse me. Tennessee had 11, and Texas had 32. So that's a lot of votes, and the candidates are campaigning for the state votes, as you say, but they're also campaigning for individual votes. And both of these guys were very experienced in politics. They both didn't really have any shady past, if you will. I mean, there wasn't a lot of negativity, really, would you say, with this election until the actual end of the election?
I think up toward the end was probably the most negative part of it. I mean, I think there was some negativity going into it, as is typical for a presidential election. But I don't think it. I think it really, what was it? About a week before election night, the DUI for George W. Bush from years earlier, like in his college days or something, had come up, and so I think it did get really nasty there toward the end. And of course, you remember the debates, and the first debate between Bush and Gore. Gore is on stage. and doing all that kind of stuff. And so I think it did get tense.
But
toward
nothing
the end.
compared to what
Not like-
people in recent elections would
I
say.
mean, you didn't have the Donald Trump, Joe Biden first debate where they're telling each other to shut up.
Right.
You didn't have anything like that.
and or calling somebody nasty.
Yeah,
and,
no.
it was. They both disagreed in the policies.
Yeah, and I think also when you get to the real nasty stuff for people like that, it's the surrogates.
Right.
It's the talking heads. It's the people going out there. They're the ones that dig into the mud the quickest.
Which and that's what really starts happening, on the night of November 7th, 2000. So, these candidates have been campaigning. A very hard and aggressive, very expensive campaign. Got the debates that have been going on. But at the end of the day, typical election, typical campaign season, debates, as you mentioned. You've got them traveling all across the United States. You've got individuals advocating on their behalf. You've got, you have presidents that are advocating for both of these individuals. You've got Daddy Bush, of course, who is adamant that his son is destined to be the president of the United States. And then with Al Gore, and this is, once again, something that could be up for topic of discussion, but if you think about the former president that he had, or actually current president at that time, who was running, Bill Clinton there, do you think that Bill Clinton was a positive impact for Gore, or could it have been a negative just with what Clinton was going through at the time? Because not just with scandals, but just in general as far as his policies.
I think it probably would have been a help as long as you could keep some of the scandals out. But you think about Al Gore and Bill Clinton, the two couldn't have been more different. Bill Clinton was this sort of, I don't want to say hippie, he wasn't a hippie, but he was just sort of this, on Arsenio Hall playing the saxophone. I remember that very well.
Yeah.
Going on MTV and they're asking him, did he inhale? And, and you just can't see Al Gore doing that, at least not doing it and coming across as naturally as Bill Clinton did. But I think Clinton probably couldn't have hurt. But Al Gore, he's so straight-laced. He's so, he's so right down the middle. He's not going to veer. I do remember hearing accounts that, Al Gore and Clinton sometimes had a little tension because Clinton ran a very loose ship, and Al Gore wasn't real comfortable with that, and maybe wanting a little bit more tighter button on some things.
And one thing too is we've discovered throughout the years, even in some of the podcasts we've talked about, that presidents and vice presidents don't always have the best relationship.
Yeah.
And a lot of times presidents can just relegate the vice president to doing ceremonial duties and basically not even have much of an impact on the agenda and on particular things.
Yeah, and it's really only recently that you see vice presidents being quote unquote important. A lot of, if you ask people, who was Martin Van Buren's vice president? Good gracious, I don't even know that off the top of my head. So a lot of vice presidents, throughout history have sort of been lost, I guess, to history. People don't really remember them that well.
But then they come into their own being at their own respective time. And, honestly, if Bush v. Gore, this court case doesn't happen, and it's not this major election aspect, it's probably just like you mentioned, somebody asking who was Bill Clinton's vice president.
Yeah.
But it's because of what happened on November 7th that really turned the tables.
And let's talk about November 7, because going into November 7, the polls were close. I think everybody knew or expected the election to be close. I remember on that night, we can go back to sort of what we did on the 9/11 episode. I remember on that night, like I used to do, I would stay up, so like Christmas night, waiting for Santa Claus. I would stay up and wait for the election returns. And just like with the 9/11 episode, I was working at the bank, and I stayed up as long as I could, and I thought Al Gore had won because I think they had called Florida for Al Gore. And so I went on to bed and woke up a little later, and it was across the bottom of the screen, too close to call. And needless to say, I was up the rest of the night. Went into work the next morning, absolutely useless.
Right.
I should not have gone to work.
Right.
During the lunch break, I went out to my truck and fell asleep, and somebody had to come out and wake me up to get me back into the building. But it was it was a weird thing because you expected back then anyway, you did expect when you woke up before you went to bed that night, or at least when you woke up the next morning, you would know who the next president was going to be.
Yeah, we're really going to probably share with our podcast listeners too much information about how much of history nerds we are.
Yeah.
I was the same way, except I'm probably a little nerdier because I actually had a sheet with the 50 states.
Uh-huh.
And so as they called them, I would highlight them blue and red.
Yeah.
And because remember, internet is not around, right? I mean, we don't have this 24/7 news cycle. We're looking at what ABC and CBS and NBC are doing. We relied on newspapers back then in the morning to tell us what we needed, and so we were devoted to. And usually the returns, it wasn't this exit polls and entrance polls, and as the votes came in, that's when you found out. And so yes, by 8 p.m. the news stations came in, and I remember getting really, really upset because at 8 p.m. they came in and said that Al Gore had won Florida, and so I shaded Al Gore
They messed up your color chart.
By 10 o'clock, my color chart was messed up, and I was really upset because it wasn't an erasable crown. So what do? I mean, because by 10 o'clock, they're now saying, "Oh no, we've made a mistake. We have told you.
Chris got
told you wrong."
NBC got a call from Chris that night.
Yes, I wrote a letter. I was upset because you messed up my chart. You messed up my thing, and so they took back their projections. And Ray, news stations don't like to admit that they're wrong. They don't admit that they're wrong.
But I think they really probably jumped the gun on this one. They called the state of Texas, and parts of the Panhandle hadn't even finished voting yet, and it was there was still more votes coming in. There was still more counting to be done, and I think they had sort of jumped the gun on it a little.
But why do they jump the gun?
Well, ratings.
Exactly.
I mean, we're going to be the first station to declare Al Gore to be the next president of the United States, to be president number 43.
I mean, we do that today.
Yeah.
I don't know these people, right? But I know that when election times comes, there's this guy on CNN's got this big whiteboard, big electric
John
board.
King,
right.
Yeah.
And then you turn to the MSB. Now it's the guy with the white shirt and the pants and his shirt's rolled up, and he's acting all crazy, and they got him doing all kinds of stuff, right? I mean, so it's all about ratings, and it's got to be the first. I mean, this goes all the way back to the beginning of newspapers. You wanted to be the first one with the news, because if you were the first one with the news, people were more likely to watch you.
Truman v. Dewey.
Yeah, and they screwed that one up royally, right? I mean, to the point where Dewey was really happy because he thought he won, and the newspapers even said he won. And so
it was a mess that the media had created that night, and it wasn't just simply affecting people like you or people like me. It was affecting the candidates. Al Gore had called because they had switched it back.
Well, 8 o'clock. Yeah, 8 o'clock was
They called it for Gore, then they switched it back.
2 o'clock was too close to call. 2 a.m. it was then Bush.
And at that point, Al Gore calls George W. Bush and concedes. And then later on, he calls Bush back when he realizes maybe I shouldn't have done that. And he takes it back. And I found a little bit of a transcript. George W. Bush says to Al Gore, "You mean to tell me, Mr. Vice President, you're retracting your concession?" End quote. And Gore replied, quote, "You don't have to be snippy about it. Let me explain something. Your younger brother is not the ultimate authority on this," end quote. So I don't know what the whole conversation was, but I take it just from that little snippet, it wasn't a pleasant conversation.
No, but you just said something in that. You said younger brother. So
Yeah,
talk a little bit about how the younger brother plays into this.
Yeah, Jeb Bush, for people who were too young to remember or people who maybe forgotten, Jeb Bush was governor of Florida. And not only was Jeb Bush the governor of Florida, the lady who was the Secretary of State who was overseeing the Florida election, a lady by the name of Katherine Harris, she was the co-chair of the Bush for President Committee in the state of Florida.
Right.
So I guess if you're Al Gore, you're sitting there thinking the deck is stacked against me here in Florida, so I'm going to have to, sort of put my foot down and say, look, your brother doesn't decide what's going on here.
So let's just review this for a second with that very important information that you have just given. The governor of Florida is the brother to a person running for president.
Yeah.
Katherine Harris, who is the Secretary of State who manages the elections for the state of Florida, is the co-chairman of Bush's campaign. Mm-hmm. At 8 o'clock that night...
No conflict of interest there at all.
Right. So at 8 o'clock at night, the news report shows that Gore has won Florida, which means that Bush is going to lose the presidency and he's not going to win, right? Mm-hmm. So then at 10 o'clock, all of a sudden, it starts changing again. Yep. Wait a second. Maybe we have it wrong. You know, we're going to take back our projections. And then at 2 o'clock, it's like, well, now that we've looked at the numbers, Bush is now going to win, and we're going to declare Bush the winner. So just in a matter of a few hours, and while it is true that Bush was leading Gore by 1,784 votes, if you're asking for a fair, balanced, authentic relationship, it just doesn't look good. It could be 100% true, and everything is legit. But those factors, governor is the brother, co-chairman is head of the elections, Florida is the swing state for who becomes president. You understand why Al Gore is saying, let's just settle down.
If I was in Al Gore's shoes, I'd have been doing the same thing. Of course, I probably wouldn't have called and conceded, but that was just me.
Right. But so you had so if we look at that, Bush is winning, but it doesn't matter if Bush is winning by the popular votes. That doesn't matter, right? Because it's all about the electoral votes.
Yeah, and the electoral votes, it all really came down to Florida. I mean, this thing was so close, it would ultimately come down to the state of Florida. And interestingly enough, I've always found it very interesting that if Al Gore had won his home state of Tennessee, Florida would have been irrelevant. Right. We would never have heard about the debacle in Florida, and we're going to talk about hanging chads, and that's a phrase I hadn't heard in a while. Right. Hanging chads and all that. But if he had won Tennessee, he would have been president, and Florida would have been just just how much he was going to win the presidency.
Florida being 25 electoral votes, Tennessee being 11. Yeah. Once again, I'm a big supporter of the Electoral College because I think it proves that the small state can have a say. Yeah. And that small state, 11 votes, actually does. I mean, we talk about Florida.
Could have
Tennessee should say, hey, what about us? Don't leave us out of the equation.
They could have pushed Gore over the finish line.
Absolutely, but as it stood right then, you have Bush having won 246 electoral votes. You have Gore that's won 260. Ray, all you need is 270. Your point exactly. If Tennessee would have been, that's 11 votes. He's at 271. He wins. We go home. This is never an issue. You don't have to sleep in your truck and give somebody money that maybe you should. I hope you didn't get in trouble that day with the banking industry.
No, I did not.
But you understand what happens, right? Yeah. That's a serious issue. And so it all comes back to Florida. And so Al Gore does what he should do. He tells the George Bush, hey, I'm not going to concede, and I'm going to ask for a recount.
And they do a series of recounts. They do machine recounts, and of course they're wanting the hand recounts. And of course, then the ballots themselves are going to become a problem because in certain counties in Florida, they were using these butterfly ballots. And basically, the way I best know how to explain this is that you had the candidate's name. There was, I guess, 2 rows of candidates and a little spot where you're supposed to use this like hole punch machine to punch out the name beside the hole beside the candidate you were wanting to vote for. The problem was some people weren't punching the holes all the way through. The hole puncher didn't go all the way through the paper. In some cases, the ballots looked like people maybe were trying to vote for Al Gore and in fact had voted for Pat Buchanan, which I'm sure was traumatic for the people who may have done that.
Right.
So you have this big mess, and you remember the TV videos of these recounters holding these ballots up to the light just to see if they could see light coming through, and it was a mess down there. Trying to figure out who. All right, this person, you've got 2 different. It looks like they may have voted for 2 different people for president. Who were they intending to vote for? It was a very big mess that they had down there.
But let's add to the mess, and we keep reinforcing the narrative and the people that are involved, the governor, Secretary of State, both part of George Bush's, family, if you will. Well, here's the thing. So this was on November 7th. Well, according to Florida law, it said, sure, you can do manual recounts. Actually, it was required to do a manual recount if the contest was closer than like 0.5% or something like that. And so they did the manual recount, and they kept finding out that Bush's lead had gone down to 327 votes. Well, now here's the problem. So Florida law says, sure, you can do manual recounts, but Florida's huge.
Yeah. 67 counties.
How much?
67 counties.
So 67 counties, and the Florida law said if you do manual recounts, that's fine, but you have to deliver your results to the Florida Secretary of State, just so happens to be the co-chairman of Bush's campaign, by November 14th. And the county said, listen, you can't ask us. I mean, think about Miami. Miami-Dade County has like 1.8 million votes, and you've got to do a manual recount. You're thinking, there's no way that I can get this done by November 14th. I've got issues with this. And so the Florida statute also was confusing because it had two statutes about late vote counts that contradicted each other. One statute said that the Secretary of State shall ignore late returns, and the other statute said the Secretary may ignore late returns. Well, Ray, if you are the co-chairman of Bush's campaign and you're the Florida Secretary of State, then you're probably going to stick to a November 14th deadline because you don't want to drag this off, especially if your candidate's winning.
That's right.
You'd rather just call it what it is and move on. And that's exactly what she does. She says, listen, I'm not taking any more results
She
after.
certified the votes.
She was done.
Yeah.
It's over with. So November 14th, she's like, done. We're good. And so moving on, let's do this. And Al Gore says, not so fast, my friend.
Well, Al Gore, I think Al Gore did have a good point because counties were doing this different. There wasn't the same standard from one county to another county, so there was no consistent standard. So, of course, this is going to go into the courts. This isn't just going to stay with volunteers in a fire department, whatever, looking at ballots through their glasses or whatever. And so this is going to get to the Florida Supreme Court. And the Florida Supreme Court is going to order a recount of the undervotes. And I suppose that would be the votes that were in dispute, the votes that were really going to make the difference here. And this, of course, is appealed by the Bush team to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court, of course, is going to play a very big role in what's getting ready to happen here.
And we need to pause for a minute because, people might be saying, okay, I get this, but really what's important? Here's why this becomes really, really important, because now we're in this second extension, right, where they have until November the 26th to be able to do the counts and things of that nature. Well, at the deadline of November 26th, once again, Miami-Dade County had 9,000 votes that they could not count.
Right.
Why is that important? Because, Ray, one of the wonderful privileges of being a citizen of the United States is that your vote matters.
Yeah.
And your vote is just as important as mine. And so what we have now is that on November 26th, 9,000 people, their votes just don't get counted because the manual recount has ran out of time.
Yeah. And the Supreme Court, looks at this and goes, this can't continue. This is a mess. So the Supreme Court rules. There's actually, everybody knows the 5-4 ruling.
Right.
That ultimately would end up making Bush president. Everybody's familiar with that one. But there was another ruling that the Supreme Court gave, and I know you're sort of the Supreme Court guru between the two of us. But the other Supreme Court's decision was 7-2 that the recount, the way it was being conducted in the state of Florida, was unconstitutional.
Yeah, and this is a huge issue that comes up that, you have to ask yourself, it's called the principle of equality. That's what they're really trying to focus on. And you've got 7 justices who say, listen, I'm just going to be honest. I think that this is a denial of the Equal Protection Clause as found in the 14th Amendment, that everybody has due process and everybody has that right. The same thing, your vote matters, right? Your vote counts. And this is this denial of equal protection, and they share this concern. I mean, you have all of these that come in and they're just like, look, this is really important, that equal protection could have been denied. And then it leads to, okay, so are we as a Supreme Court now creating a new principle of equality when it comes to voting? Is this principle going to be the basis for future successful challenges? And so the court has to say, listen, wait. we are not instituting something known as precedent. What we're doing is just focusing on this one case.
Yeah.
Our decision that we are looking at is based on Florida. It's based on these hanging chads. It's based on this manual recount. It is not going to be about any other court or any other election. So just hold off and understand that our vote right here is just on this election. That making sure that the denial of equal protection is not seen. And so that was a huge issue. And then another important issue is, was the court justified in ending the counting in Florida?
And that was the 5-4 decision.
That's
that
the 5-4.
The 7-2 decision just simply said what's going on there is a major problem. It's unconstitutional, denial of the 14th Amendment. But then it was, do they still have time to do the recount before the certification by the Electoral College and all that? And the answer by the court 5-4 was no, it's got to stop.
Based on simply because of what law stated.
Right.
And that was what the Supreme Court was really focusing on. We have to go by what the law says. Mm-hmm. And they were really mad at Florida because Florida had the messed up laws. I mean, as you just mentioned, where it said, one statute said that the Secretary of Affairs, she could ignore. Another one said she couldn't. And so the Supreme Court's really mad at the state of Florida because they're saying your laws aren't making sense, and it's putting us in a bad situation. But I think it's also important for our listeners to note that Supreme Court does not declare George Bush as president of the United States.
No, they just simply stopped the counting, and the clock was running out on the Gore team, and they just simply did not have time to keep this thing going. And I watched an interview with Al Gore, and this interview was done, I want to say, this past summer 2021, and they were asking him about, why he conceded when he did. And I do want to talk about some things he said in his concession, why he conceded when he did and all that. And he said because it was very clear to us that there was no path forward, that even if we had continued to challenge it, if it had gone to the House of Representatives, the outcome was still going to be George Bush. So, he makes the point, and he's going to make the point in his concession speech as well, that just for the good of the nation, it's so very important people hear that nowadays, for the good of the nation, I'm just going to step aside. Well, I hope everybody's enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. Please feel free to look us up on Facebook. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on Stitcher, Google Podcast, Sounder FM. We're on Spotify. Share this podcast with your friends and family. Share it on social media. If you'd like to contact us, you can always contact us with suggestions, with complaints, or whatever you want to contact us with. Feel free to do so. Our email is historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter U, should know @gmail.com. And as usual, until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk at you later.